The fire had already been lit when Elara realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her sides and forced them still. Around her, the entire pack stood in a wide circle under the night sky, waiting for their alpha to speak the words that would decide everything. Elara had waited 3 years to hear those words meant for her. Tonight, she finally believed they would be. She was wrong before Cade even opened his mouth. She saw it in the way his eyes moved past her, past the space she had always occupied at his side, and settled instead on a young woman standing near the edge of the crowd. Briar. A visitor from the Ashcombe pack, soft-spoken and unassuming, the kind of woman nobody argued with because there was nothing to argue about. Elara had spoken to her twice. Both times, Briar had smiled and said very little. Cade stepped forward. The crowd went quiet in the way crowds do when they sense something is about to be announced, not asked. "Tonight," he said, "I choose my mate." Elara's chest tightened. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself a lot of things in the seconds that followed, none of which turned out to be true. "Briar of Ashcombe," Cade said, "will you stand with me?" The words landed like something falling from a great height, slow at first, then all at once. Elara did not gasp. She did not step back. She stood very still and reached for her sleeve and straightened the cuff of it, though it was already straight, and straightened it again. Around her, people were clapping. Somewhere, someone called out a blessing. Briar walked forward with her head bowed in a show of humility that Elara suspected was at least partly real. Cade took her hand in front of everyone, in front of Elara, in front of the fire that had been burning since before the ceremony began, and he did not once look toward the woman who had stood beside him through 3 years of decisions no one else had been trusted to make. Elara had built a house out of a maybe. Tonight it came down all at once, and there was no sound at all when it did. She did not remember deciding to leave the circle. She only remembered that at some point her feet were moving, carrying her past the fire, past the tables of food no one had touched yet, past a group of pups who did not understand why the pack's second was walking away from the pack's greatest celebration. She kept walking until the noise behind her thinned into something distant, until the cold night air replaced the smell of wood smoke, until she was standing alone behind the kitchen tents with her hands pressed against a wooden post, breathing like she had run a long way instead of simply walked. She did not cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she would not cry over things that could be fixed with enough patience, enough time, enough waiting. It took her exactly this long to understand that patience had been the wrong tool from the beginning. "You're not wearing the right face for a party," a voice said. Elara turned. She recognized the voice before she recognized the shape in the dark, and when she did recognize him, her stomach dropped for an entirely different reason. Ronan Vale stood a few feet away, arms crossed, leaning against the corner of the tent, as though he had been standing there for some time. He was the alpha of Blackridge, the rival pack that shared an uneasy truce with Thornwood, the kind of truce built more out of exhaustion than trust. His presence here tonight was a formality, an invitation extended out of old obligation. He was not supposed to be standing behind the kitchen tents, watching her fall apart. "I didn't realize Blackridge sent spies to celebrations," Elara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "We don't," Ronan said. "I came because I was invited. I stayed back here because the fire was too bright, and I wanted to see the stars." "That's a lie." "Most of it," he agreed. She should have walked away from him. Every rule she had ever been taught about rival packs told her to walk away from him. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, staring at the dark shape of the trees beyond the tents, willing herself not to think about the way Cade's hand had closed around Briar's without a single hesitation. "You were his second," Ronan said. "It was not a question." "I still am." "For how much longer?" The question should have made her angry. Instead, it made something in her chest crack open just slightly, just enough to let a small, cold truth slip through. She did not answer him. She did not need to. He already knew the answer, and so, somewhere underneath the numbness, did she. I have a truck, Ronan said. It's parked past the tree line. It has a broken radio and a bad heater, and I am leaving in 10 minutes, whether you're in it or not. Why would I get in your truck? Because you're standing behind a tent in the cold instead of celebrating with your pack, and I don't think that's going to change if you stay another hour. He pushed off the tent post and started walking, unhurried, toward the trees. He did not look back to see if she would follow. That, more than anything he had said, was what made her decide. She followed him. The truck was exactly as he described it, old and dented along one side, with a heater that rattled when it finally kicked on, and a radio dial that spun uselessly when she touched it, catching no station at all. Alara turned it anyway, over and over, filling the silence of the cab with the small, meaningless click of a broken knob, because it gave her hands something to do that was not clenching into fists. Ronan did not ask her why she was leaving. He did not offer sympathy, did not tell her that Cade was a fool, did not fill the quiet with the kind of comfort that would have made her cry the moment she let her guard down. He simply drove, one hand on the wheel, the headlights carving a narrow path through the dark trees, as though this were an ordinary night, and she were an ordinary passenger, and none of what had happened back at the circle had happened at all. "You don't have to talk," he said eventually, when the silence had stretched long enough that even he seemed to notice it. "But you also don't have to keep breaking that radio." Alara looked down at her hand, still resting on the dial. She let it go. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him, a small crack in the composure she had been holding since the moment Cade said Briar's name. "You're leaving," Ronan said simply. "That's what you're doing. The rest of it, you can figure out later." "You don't even know why I'm leaving." "I have a guess. You weren't even looking at the ceremony." "I was looking at you," he said, and something in the flat, unremarkable way he said it made it land harder than if he had tried to make it sound romantic. He was not performing comfort. He was simply telling her a fact, the way he might have told her the road ahead had a turn in it. "You straightened your sleeve 4 times before you left. People don't do that unless something just broke." Alara said nothing. Outside the window, the trees blurred past, dark shapes against a darker sky, and somewhere behind them, miles back now, the fire of the choosing ceremony was still burning, and the pack she had served for 3 years was still celebrating a union that did not include her. She did not know yet what it would mean to arrive at Blackridge as an outsider, or what price she might pay for climbing into the truck of a rival alpha on the very night her own alpha had chosen someone else. She only knew that for the first time all evening, the tightness in her chest had eased just slightly, replaced by something that felt less like grief and more like the beginning of a decision she had not fully made yet, but would not take back. The road curved ahead of them, leading toward unfamiliar territory, and Alara Voss did not look back. Ahead, past a ridge of dark pine trees, a scattering of lights marked the beginning of Blackridge land, small and steady against the black horizon, nothing at all like the bonfire she had left behind. Ronan slowed the truck as the road narrowed, glancing at her once, briefly, as if checking that she was still real and still beside him and had not changed her mind somewhere between 1 mile marker and the next. She had not. Whatever waited for her in Blackridge, whatever consequences came from a Thornwood second walking straight into rival territory on the night her alpha chose another mate, she would face them there, in daylight, on her own 2 feet, not standing at the edge of someone else's circle, straightening a sleeve that was already straight, waiting for a future that had never actually been promised to her. The truck rolled forward into the dark, and behind them, the fire at Thornwood burned on without her. She thought of the years she had spent learning every rule of that pack, memorizing every border, every treaty, every quiet signal that told her when danger was near. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake beside Cade, planning routes and watching maps, never once asking for anything in return except the promise she believed was already hers. None of that training had prepared her for this, for sitting in the passenger seat of an enemy's truck with nothing behind her but smoke and nothing ahead but unfamiliar road. Ronan did not fill the silence with questions she was not ready to answer. He drove steadily, watching the road, occasionally glancing toward the tree line as though checking for something she could not see. Once, his shoulders tensed slightly, and his eyes flicked to the mirror, then relaxed again just as quickly. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Old habit. You get used to watching for things that aren't there anymore." She wanted to ask what things, and whose habit, and how long he had been carrying it, but her own night had already taken more than she had energy to spend on someone else's guarded history. She looked back out the window, watching the last glow of the bonfire fade behind the hills, until there was nothing left of it at all, just dark trees and a narrow road leading somewhere she had never been invited before tonight. The gates of Blackridge rose ahead of them, plain and unremarkable, 2 wooden posts and a chain that a young guard lowered the moment he recognized the truck. He glanced at Alara with open surprise, his eyes flicking to Ronan for some kind of explanation, but Ronan only nodded him through without a word, and the truck rolled past the gate into territory that, until tonight, Alara had only ever been trained to view as a threat. She did not know what waited for her past those posts. She only knew there was no version of tonight where she could have stayed at that fire and pretended nothing had changed. Alara woke to unfamiliar light coming through unfamiliar curtains, and for one long moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the fire, the circle, and Cade's voice saying Briar's name came back all at once, and she sat up too fast, her head spinning slightly, her chest tightening the way it had the night before. The room was plain but clean, a bed, a wooden dresser, a window that looked out over a stretch of dense forest instead of the open fields she was used to at Thornwood. Someone had left a folded set of clothes on the chair beside the bed, simple and practical, nothing that suggested any particular kindness, only that whoever had left them understood she had arrived with nothing. She dressed slowly, delaying the moment she would have to step outside and face an entire pack that had every reason to see her as an intruder. When she finally opened the door, she found Ronan waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall with the same unhurried patience he had shown the night before. "You slept," he said. It was not quite a question. "Some." "Good, you'll need it." He pushed off the wall and started walking, and she fell into step beside him, because she did not know what else to do. There are people here who are going to ask why a Thornwood second is standing in our territory. I'd like you to have an answer ready that isn't the truth, because the truth will get you challenged before breakfast. What do you suggest? That you're here as my guest, under my protection, and that anyone with questions can bring them to me directly. He said it simply, without any weight of romance or promise attached to it, but Alara understood exactly what it meant. He was placing himself between her and an entire pack that did not know her, had no reason to trust her, and would very likely see her presence as either an insult or an opportunity. "Why would you do that?" "Because I don't like watching people get thrown to wolves they didn't choose to fight," he said, and then, after a pause, added dryly, "No pun intended." Despite everything, something close to a laugh rose in her chest before she caught it and pushed it back down. It felt wrong to laugh less than a day after the worst night of her life, and yet some small part of her noticed that Ronan had managed to make her feel, for just a moment, like a person instead of a wound. The dining hall, when they reached it, went quiet the moment she stepped through the door. Rows of Blackridge wolves sat at long wooden tables, and every single one of them turned to look at the stranger walking in beside their alpha. Alara kept her spine straight and her chin level, the same posture she had used for 3 years standing at Cade's side during difficult negotiations, though this time there was no one standing beside her who actually belonged to this room. A woman near the front table stood, her arms crossed, her expression sharp enough to cut. "Ronan," she said, "would you care to explain why Thornwood second is standing in our dining hall?" "She's a guest," Ronan said simply. "Under my protection. That's all anyone needs to know, Grace." Grace's eyes moved over Alara with open suspicion, the kind of look that measured threat before it measured anything else. "Guests don't usually arrive during someone else's choosing ceremony," she said, Guests don't usually leave one pack for another in the middle of the night. I didn't ask your opinion on the timing, Ronan said, his voice calm but final, in a way that ended the conversation before it could go further. Grace held his gaze a moment longer, then sat back down, though her eyes stayed on Alara for a long time after that, sharp and unconvinced. The rest of the hall did not challenge Ronan directly, but Alara felt every eye in the room measuring her, weighing her presence against whatever they had already heard, or guessed, or assumed about why she was standing here in borrowed clothes with nothing of her own. She ate very little that morning, not because she was not hungry, but because every bite felt watched, every movement felt recorded, and she could not shake the sense that she had traded one kind of pressure for a different, colder version of the same thing. After the meal, Ronan walked her out to the training yard, a wide-open space bordered by tall fencing, where a handful of pack members were already sparring in pairs, their movements sharp and practiced. He gestured toward it with a small nod. "You need something to do with your hands that isn't twisting a broken radio dial," he said. "I run the training here myself, 3 mornings a week. You're welcome to join, if standing around feeling watched isn't your idea of a good time. Won't that make things worse? A Thornwood wolf training with Blackridge fighters." "Maybe," Ronan admitted, "but it'll also show them you're not hiding, and that matters more than you think it does." She took his advice, mostly because the alternative was sitting alone in a borrowed room with nothing but her own thoughts for company, and her own thoughts had proven themselves poor companions in the last day. The training was hard, harder than she expected, her body unused to the different rhythm of Blackridge techniques, her reflexes calibrated for a different pack's habits. She fell twice in the first hour, and both times she got back up before anyone could offer a hand, because she was not ready to accept help that might come with strings attached, even from strangers who seemed to want nothing from her at all. By midday, a young wolf named Finn, barely out of his teenage years, approached her cautiously during a break, holding out a water skin. "You fight different than us," he said, not unkindly. "Sharper, faster, maybe, but you overcommit on the left." "Do I?" "Every time." He shrugged, embarrassed suddenly by his own boldness. "Sorry, I didn't mean anything by it." "No," Alara said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "Thank you. Nobody's told me that in 3 years." It was such a small exchange, barely worth noticing, and yet it was the first moment since the ceremony that she had felt like herself, instead of like the woman standing at the edge of a fire, watching her future disappear into someone else's hands. She held on to that small moment carefully, the way she had once held on to Cade's promises, except this time she understood, with a clarity that almost hurt, that she was not waiting for anything from Finn or from Ronan or from anyone else in this yard. She was simply standing in it, breathing, existing, learning to overcommit less on the left. That evening, alone in the small room she had been given, Alara sat by the window and watched the last light fade over the Blackridge forest. Somewhere behind those trees, miles away, Thornwood was likely still celebrating, still adjusting to its new alpha's mate, still moving forward without the woman who had spent 3 years keeping it running smoothly. She wondered if Cade had noticed yet how many small things she used to handle without anyone asking, how many decisions she had quietly made so that he never had to. She wondered if he would notice at all, or if he was too wrapped up in his new happiness to feel the absence of someone he had never truly seen. A knock at her door interrupted the thought. She opened it to find Ronan standing there, a folder of papers in one hand. "Border reports," he said. "Something's been testing our eastern fence line the last 2 weeks. Small movements, nothing confirmed, but enough that I don't like it. I thought, given your experience with Thornwood's patrol routes, you might have an opinion. You want my professional opinion on your pack's security." "I want the opinion of the best second Thornwood ever had," he said, without any particular emphasis, as though it were simply a fact rather than a compliment, and somehow that made it land harder than flattery would have. "Whether or not you still belong to them." She took the folder from him, And for the first time since the fire, since Cade's voice, since Briar's bowed head, Ilara felt something other than grief settle into the space where her old life used to be. It was small, and it was uncertain, and it had absolutely nothing to do with romance or rescue. It felt, simply, like the beginning of being useful again, in a place that had not yet decided whether to trust her, and somewhere underneath that fragile beginning, a quieter thought she was not ready to examine too closely, that the small, steady presence of Ronan Vale had become, in less than a day, the only thing about this strange new territory that did not feel like a threat. She did not let herself think further than that. Not yet. Instead, she opened the folder and began to read. The first thing Ilara noticed in the border reports was the pattern nobody else had bothered to connect. 3 sightings along the eastern fence line, spaced 11 days apart, each one logged by a different patrol and dismissed as unrelated. But the timing was too precise to be random, and the locations formed a rough line pointing directly at the old logging road that cut through the forest toward a stretch of unclaimed land between Blackridge and a third pack neither Thornwood nor Blackridge dealt with often. A pack called Hollow Vein, known mostly for staying out of everyone's business and asking for nothing in return. Until now, apparently. "Someone's mapping your patrol rotation," Ilara said, spreading the reports across the table in Ronan's study the next morning. "Not testing the fence, watching it, learning when your guards change shifts and how long the gaps last." Ronan leaned over the table, studying the marks she had circled. Hollow Vein has never made a move against anyone in a decade. Then either something changed or someone new is giving the orders. She tapped the last circled date. This happened 4 days ago. If the pattern holds, there's another gap in coverage tonight, right around midnight, on the northern curve past the old mill. Ronan straightened, his expression shifting from mild concern into something sharper, more focused. "You want to sit on this all day, or you want to come look at the mill with me?" "I want to look at the mill." They left before sundown, taking a narrow trail through the trees that Ronan clearly knew from memory, moving fast and quiet in a way that reminded Ilara, uncomfortably, of every border patrol she had ever run with Cade, except this time the stakes felt different, sharper somehow, because she had nothing familiar to fall back on if things went wrong. The old mill sat at the edge of a clearing, its wooden frame collapsed on one side, vines climbing through broken windows. Ronan raised a hand, signaling her to stop, and they crouched together behind a fallen log at the tree line, watching the structure in silence. For a long while nothing happened. Then Ilara caught movement, a shift of shadow near the mill's collapsed doorway, followed by a second shape, then a third. 3 figures, moving carefully, spreading out around the mill's perimeter in a formation that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with planning. "That's not a border test," Ronan whispered. "That's a staging point." Staging for what? Before he could answer, one of the figures turned, and moonlight caught the side of his face, and Ilara's stomach dropped for the second time in 2 days, though for an entirely different reason. She knew that face. She had seen it at Thornwood exactly once, 3 months earlier, standing quietly at the edge of a trade negotiation, introduced briefly as a representative of Hollow Vein's council. His name was Derek, and he had said almost nothing during the entire meeting, which she remembered now, uneasily, as exactly the kind of behavior that meant someone was listening far more than they were speaking. "I've seen him before," she breathed. "At Thornwood, he was there for a trade meeting. That's not a coincidence." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." They watched a few minutes longer, long enough to confirm the group was setting markers along the mill's perimeter, small painted stones half hidden in the underbrush, the kind of subtle trail markings used to guide a larger group moving at night without needing torches or noise. Whatever was being planned, this was not the full force. This was reconnaissance, preparing the ground for something bigger. Ronan touched her arm, a silent signal to retreat, and they backed away from the log carefully, moving only when the wind covered the sound of their footsteps, until they were far enough into the trees to stand and move at a normal pace. "We need to get back and warn the pack," Ronan said. already moving fast through the trees. They had gone perhaps 100 yards when a low growl rose from somewhere ahead of them, cutting through the darkness, and two more shapes emerged from the trees, directly in their path, blocking the trail back toward Blackridge. They doubled their perimeter, Elara said quietly. They knew someone might come looking. Ronan's shoulders squared, his posture shifting into something coiled and ready. Stay behind me. I'm not standing behind anyone, Elara said, and there was no anger in her voice, only the flat certainty of someone who had spent 3 years training exactly for a moment like this one. I fight beside you, or I don't fight at all. There was no time to argue the point. The two figures closed the distance fast, and the fight that followed was short, brutal in its speed rather than its violence, more about controlling space than causing harm. Elara moved on instinct, ducking low, using the uneven ground to her advantage, the way Finn had warned her not to overcommit, correcting the flaw in her old training without even meaning to. Ronan fought beside her, not in front of her, matching her rhythm instead of overshadowing it, and within a handful of tense, breathless minutes, both intruders had been driven back into the trees, retreating rather than risk further exposure now that their approach had failed. Elara stood in the sudden quiet afterward, breathing hard, her hands shaking slightly from the rush of it, and for one unguarded moment, Ronan reached out and steadied her by the shoulder, his hand warm even through the cold night air. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding toward a shallow scrape along her forearm she had not even noticed. "It's nothing. It's something." He examined it briefly, his touch careful, businesslike, nothing more than what any alpha would do for an injured pack member, and yet something in the quiet focus of his attention made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "We need to move," she said, pulling back before the moment could become something neither of them had agreed to name. "If they know we saw them, they'll move up whatever timeline they had." Ronan nodded, and they ran the rest of the way back to Blackridge in silence, the forest blurring past them, urgency replacing every other thought in Elara's mind. By the time they reached the gates, Ronan was already calling for Grace, for the senior patrol leaders, for anyone who could help him prepare a pack that had, until tonight, believed its greatest threat was a rival alpha's stolen second, not an unknown enemy quietly mapping its weaknesses in the dark. The following hours moved fast, the way emergencies always do, blurring into a series of urgent, overlapping tasks. Grace, despite her earlier suspicion of Elara, listened without argument when Ronan explained what they had seen, her sharp expression sharpening further into something focused and useful. "If Hollow Vein wanted a straightforward fight, they'd have come at us directly," Grace said, pacing in front of the assembled patrol leaders. "This is patient, planned. Someone's building towards something bigger than a raid." "They're not doing this alone," Elara said, and every head in the room turned toward her, some still uncertain whether she had earned the right to speak in this room at all. Hollow Vein has never had the numbers or the ambition to move against a pack Blackridge's size. Someone is backing them. Someone with a reason to want both Blackridge and Thornwood destabilized at the same time. The silence that followed was heavy, with the same unspoken thought settling over everyone in the room. "You think this is connected to Thornwood?" Ronan said slowly. "I think Cade dismissed 3 border anomalies over the last 2 months as random wildlife activity," Elara said. "I flagged them myself before I left. He told me I was seeing threats that weren't there." Her jaw tightened. "I wasn't wrong then, and I'm not wrong now." Grace studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her earlier suspicion, not quite trust yet, but something close to respect. "If you're right," she said, "then whoever's behind this isn't just testing Blackridge, they're testing both packs at once, hoping neither side notices the other half of the pattern." "Then we need to warn Thornwood," Elara said, the words leaving her mouth before she had fully decided to say them. Every eye in the room turned toward her again, and this time the silence carried a different weight entirely, because everyone present understood exactly what she was suggesting. Sending word to the very pack she had walked away from 3 nights earlier, the pack whose alpha had chosen another woman in front of her, the pack that might not even believe a warning delivered by the second who had just defected to their rivals. Ronan watched her carefully, his expression unreadable in the low light of the study. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Alara thought of the fire, the circle, Cade's hand closing around Briar's without hesitation. She thought of every quiet warning she had raised over the last 2 months that had been dismissed without a second look. And then she thought of the pups asleep in Thornwood's dormitories tonight, and the guards standing watch along fence lines they did not yet know were being carefully, patiently mapped by someone with far larger plans than a border skirmish. "This isn't about what I want," she said finally. "It's about what's coming, whether any of us are ready for it or not." Ronan held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Then we send the warning tonight," he said. "Together. Whatever's out there, it's not going to wait for old grudges to settle themselves first." Outside, the wind moved through the trees surrounding Blackridge, carrying with it the faint, distant scent of wood smoke drifting from somewhere far beyond the border, a reminder that whatever fire still burned at Thornwood, it was no longer the only one that mattered tonight. The message reached Thornwood before sunrise, carried by a young Blackridge messenger under a flag of temporary truce, and by mid-morning, word came back that Cade himself would meet them at the shared border, alone except for a single guard, to hear what Alara had to say in person. Alara stood at the meeting point an hour before he was due to arrive, watching the tree line where the two packs' territories met, marked only by a shallow creek that neither side had ever bothered to build a proper crossing over. Ronan stood a short distance behind her, close enough to step forward if needed, far enough to let her stand at the front of this conversation on her own terms. "You don't have to be the one who tells him," Ronan said quietly. "Yes," Alara said, "I do." Cade arrived exactly on time, his expression unreadable as he crossed the creek, his guard hanging back a respectful distance. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, taking in the sight of his former second standing on the far side of a border she had crossed only days earlier, standing now beside the very alpha whose territory she had run to. "You look well," Cade said finally, and there was something careful in his voice, something that might have been guilt, trying to disguise itself as courtesy. "I didn't come here to talk about how I look," Alara said. "I came because Blackridge caught Hollow Vein mapping their eastern border 2 nights ago. Someone recognized one of the men doing it, Derek, from the trade meeting 3 months back." Cade's expression shifted, just slightly, the careful courtesy cracking to reveal something sharper underneath. "That's not possible. Hollow Vein doesn't move against anyone." "They didn't used to," Alara said. "Now they're mapping patrol gaps and placing trail markers for a larger group. And before you tell me I'm imagining threats again, ask yourself why Hollow Vein would suddenly develop an interest in Blackridge's fence line unless someone convinced them it was worth the risk. You think someone is backing them? I think you dismissed 3 border anomalies over the last 2 months because you were too busy planning a choosing ceremony to take my warnings seriously," Alara said, and for the first time since the fire, she let the full weight of that frustration into her voice, sharp and unguarded. "I think whoever is behind this counted on exactly that, a distracted Thornwood and an unprepared Blackridge, tested separately so neither side would notice the same pattern happening twice." Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the man standing across the creek looked less like the confident alpha who had chosen Briar in front of an entire pack, and more like someone quietly reckoning with a mistake he had not yet found the words for. "I need you to come back," he said abruptly. "Thornwood needs someone who can see patterns like this, someone I trust to run border security the way it needs to be run. You had that person for 3 years, Alara said. You let her walk away because it was easier than choosing her. That's not fair." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. Nothing about that night was fair, but I'm not standing here so you can offer me my old job back like nothing happened. I'm standing here because pups are sleeping in dormitories on both sides of this creek, and neither pack has time for pride while something bigger moves in the dark." Cade's guard shifted uneasily behind him, clearly uncomfortable witnessing a conversation this personal unfold in the open. Ronan remained silent, watching, his presence steady but unintrusive, a quiet reminder that Alara did not need rescuing from this conversation, only support if she wanted it. "Come back," Cade said again, softer this time, "not as my second, as my equal. Whatever role you want, Alara, name it. Thornwood needs you." For a moment, something old and familiar stirred in her chest, the ghost of 3 years spent believing this exact offer might one day come, wrapped in exactly these words. But the moment passed as quickly as it arrived, replaced by a clarity that felt, for the first time, entirely her own rather than borrowed from hope. "You didn't choose me when it mattered," she said. "You don't get to choose me now, just because it's convenient." She let the words settle, unhurried, unapologetic. "I'll help you prepare your border defenses, because that's the right thing to do, and because I won't let pups suffer for a rivalry between two alphas too proud to work together. But I'm not coming back to Thornwood, not as your second, not as anything else." Cade's eyes flicked, briefly, toward Ronan, something unreadable passing behind them, jealousy or resentment, or perhaps simple recognition of a decision already made and unlikely to be reversed. "And him?" he asked. "Is that really where you belong now?" "That's not your question to ask," Ronan said quietly, speaking for the first time, his voice calm but carrying an edge of finality that ended the conversation more effectively than anger could have. Cade studied them both for a long moment, then nodded once, sharp and resigned. "Send whatever information you have on the border markers," he said finally. "I'll double our eastern patrols starting tonight." "You'll need more than doubled patrols," Alara said. "You'll need to coordinate with Blackridge directly. Whoever is behind this is counting on both packs staying separate. That's the one advantage we can take away from them." Cade's expression flickered with something like old pride resisting new necessity, but after a moment he nodded again, more slowly this time. "Fine," he said. "A temporary alliance, shared intelligence on the border threat, nothing more." "That's all I'm asking for," Alara said. Cade turned to leave, then paused, glancing back one final time. "For what it's worth," he said, "I am sorry for how that night went. You deserved better than watching it happen in front of everyone." "I did," Alara said simply, and did not soften the words with forgiveness she did not yet feel. Some ruptures did not need closing. They only needed acknowledging, and then, eventually, the space to heal on their own time, without anyone rushing the process for the sake of a tidier ending. Cade crossed the creek back toward his own territory, his guard falling into step behind him, and within moments, the trees swallowed them both from sight. Alara stood at the border a long while after he had gone, watching the water move over smooth stones in the shallow creek, saying nothing. Ronan waited beside her, patient in the way he always seemed to be, not filling the silence with reassurance she had not asked for. "You didn't have to say all of that," he said eventually. "Yes," Alara said, "I did. How do you feel?" She considered the question honestly before answering, turning it over the way she had once turned over patrol reports, searching for the pattern underneath the surface details. "Lighter," she said finally, surprised by how true the word felt. "Not fixed, just lighter." Ronan nodded, accepting the answer without pushing for more, and together they turned back toward Blackridge, leaving the creek and the border and the conversation behind them, carrying instead the weight of a threat still moving somewhere in the dark, patient and unseen, waiting for the moment both packs would be least prepared to face it together. Neither of them yet knew how soon that moment would arrive, or how much it would cost before it was over. The attack came 4 nights later, not at the mill, and not along the eastern fence line everyone had spent days reinforcing, but from the unclaimed forest to the north, a stretch of land nobody had thought to watch closely because it belonged to neither pack and had never mattered to anyone before. Alara woke to the sound of the alarm horn cutting through the dark, a long, low note that every wolf in Blackridge had been trained since childhood to recognize as danger. She was dressed and moving before the second note finished sounding, pulling on boots as Ronan's voice rose somewhere down the hall, calling orders to patrol leaders, already scrambling into formation. They came from the north, Grace said, breathless, meeting them at the door with a torch in one hand. Hollow vein, and at least 20 more we don't recognize. They're already past the tree line. 20 more, Ronan repeated, his voice tight. That's not Hollow Vein's numbers. That's someone else's army wearing their name. Cade's patrol just crossed the border to help, Grace added. He said he wasn't about to let a shared threat pick off one pack at a time while he watched from across a creek. Alara felt something shift in her chest at that, something that was not quite forgiveness but was, perhaps, the first quiet step toward it. There was no time to examine the feeling further. The horn sounded again, closer now, and the sky beyond the trees glowed faintly orange, torchlight, or worse, spreading through the northern woods. They ran. The fighting, when they reached it, was chaos in the way real danger always is, nothing like the careful, controlled skirmish at the old mill. Bodies moved fast through smoke and shadow, shouted commands overlapping from every direction. The ground churned and uneven beneath running feet. Alara fought beside Ronan without thinking, the two of them moving in a rhythm they had built without ever discussing it, each covering the space the other left open, each trusting the other completely in a way that required no words at all. Somewhere through the chaos, she caught sight of Cade fighting a short distance away, flanked by two of his own guards, driving back a group of attackers with the same steady discipline she remembered from years of training beside him. For one strange, suspended moment, the three of them, Alara, Ronan, and Cade, found themselves fighting the same enemy from three different directions, united by nothing except the shared understanding that whatever was coming for Blackridge tonight would come for Thornwood next, if it succeeded here first. The battle turned, slowly, painfully, as the combined forces of both packs pressed the attackers back toward the tree line they had come from. It was Alara who spotted Derek near the center of the retreating group, shouting orders in a voice too commanding for a simple council representative, and it was Alara who understood, in that single sharp moment, exactly who had been pulling the strings behind Hollow Vein's sudden ambition. "He's not just Hollow Vein," she shouted to Ronan over the noise. "He's been coordinating this the whole time. Someone gave him the resources to build an army out of a pack that never had one." They moved together, cutting through the chaos toward the center of the retreating line, and Cade, catching sight of their direction, redirected his own guards to close the gap from the opposite side, boxing Derek's remaining forces into a narrowing space between the three converging groups. Derek's confidence cracked the moment he realized the trap closing around him, his commanding voice faltering into something far less certain. The fight that followed was short and decisive, three forces that had every reason to distrust each other, working instead with a coordination none of them had planned in advance. Born entirely out of necessity, and perhaps out of something Alara did not have a name for yet, some fragile new understanding that old rivalries meant very little in the face of a threat large enough to swallow every pack whole. By the time the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Derek stood surrounded, his remaining forces scattered or fled back into the unclaimed forest, and the threat that had been quietly mapping two packs' weaknesses for months finally stood exposed, alone, and out of options. He gave up the name of his backer without much resistance once the sun rose, a minor lord from a distant territory who had hoped to weaken both Thornwood and Blackridge enough to seize the unclaimed land between them for himself. It was, in the end, a smaller and more ordinary greed than the danger it had nearly caused, though that did little to lessen the exhaustion in every face gathered at Blackridge's gates that morning. Cade lingered after the others had begun tending to the wounded and clearing the northern woods, finding Alara alone near the creek where they had spoken days earlier. "We did that well," he said. "The three of us." "We did," Alara agreed. "I meant what I said before, about being sorry." He looked out over the water, his expression tired in a way that had nothing to do with the night's fighting. "I think I understood you less than I thought I did, all those years. I mistook what was easy for what was right." "I know," Alara said, and this time there was no sharpness in it, only quiet acknowledgement, the kind that closes a door gently instead of slamming it shut. I hope it works out with Briar. I mean that. Cade studied her for a long moment, then nodded, something settling in his expression that looked almost like peace. I hope the same for you, he said, glancing briefly toward Blackridge's gates, where Ronan stood waiting at a respectful distance, giving them this final moment without intruding on it. Whatever this is, with him. He left without waiting for her to answer, crossing back over the creek toward his own territory one final time, and Alara watched him go without the tightness in her chest that had followed her every step since the night of the fire. It was not gone entirely. Some things did not disappear all at once. But it had eased, quietly, into something she could carry without it weighing down every moment of her days. Weeks passed before Blackridge held its own choosing ceremony. The fires built high against the autumn cold. The whole pack gathered in a wide circle beneath a sky far clearer than the one Alara remembered from Thornwood. This time, she did not stand at the edge, straightening a sleeve that was already straight, waiting to hear if someone else's name would be called instead of hers. This time, she stood in the center of the circle, and it was Ronan whose hands found something to do while he waited, adjusting the collar of his jacket once, twice, a small unconscious motion that Alara recognized immediately because it mirrored her own the night everything had fallen apart. Alara Voss, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet circle, steady despite the small human nervousness in his hands. Will you stand with me? She did not hesitate the way she once had, waiting on a promise that had never truly been hers to hold. She stepped forward, into the space beside him, and took his hand in front of the entire pack, in front of the fire, in front of everyone who had once looked at her with suspicion and now looked at her, simply, as one of their own. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, past miles of dark forest, Thornwood's own fires still burned, marking a life she had once believed would be hers forever. She did not look toward them tonight. She did not need to. She had already found the fire that was actually hers, standing steady beside her, holding her hand in front of a whole world that finally, fully, chose her back.